I am Sarah Chen, 28 years old, and I just discovered that my mother gave my entire inheritance to my brother while I was caring for our dying father. The moment I found out, sitting in that sterile lawyer's office with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, I felt something break inside me that I never knew could shatter. My mother looked me straight in the eye and said, "Marcus deserves it more. He's always been the responsible one." What she didn't know was that my grandfather had been 3 steps ahead of her greed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The betrayal didn't happen overnight. It was carved out piece by piece, year after year, until I became so accustomed to being second choice that I stopped expecting anything different. Growing up in San Diego, as the younger daughter in what everyone called the perfect Chen family, I learned early that love came with conditions, and my conditions were always harder to meet than my brother's. My father, David Chen, had built his construction empire from nothing. He started with a single truck and a toolbox inherited from his own father, working 16-hour days, pouring concrete and framing houses until his hands were permanently stained with sawdust, and his back curved from decades of heavy lifting. By the time Marcus and I were born, Chen Construction had become one of the largest residential builders in Southern California. Dad never let us forget the sacrifices he made, the meals he skipped, the family gatherings he missed to build something lasting for his children. My mother, Linda, came from old money that had been carefully preserved through 3 generations of strategic marriages and conservative investments. She met my father at a charity gala where his company was being recognized for building affordable housing. She often told the story of their first dance, how his rough contractor's hands felt against her manicured fingers, how charming she found his lack of pretense. What she never mentioned was how quickly she began trying to sand away those rough edges, to transform him into someone worthy of her social circle. Marcus arrived 2 years before me, golden-haired and easy-tempered, the kind of baby who slept through the night and smiled at strangers. From his first breath, he embodied everything my parents wanted in a son. He was athletic without being aggressive, intelligent without being challenging, ambitious in ways that aligned perfectly with their expectations. When I was born, the family dynamic had already solidified around him. I was the addition, the second child, the daughter who would never carry on the Chen name or inherit the construction business. The differences in how we were treated weren't dramatic enough to be called abuse, but they were consistent enough to shape every aspect of my childhood. When Marcus brought home a B+ on a math test, it was celebrated with dinner at his favorite restaurant. When I brought home an A- in the same subject, my mother would tilt her head and ask if I had studied hard enough. When Marcus expressed interest in joining the football team, my parents bought him the best equipment money could buy and never missed a game. When I wanted to take art classes, the conversation always turned to the cost and whether it was really necessary. By the time we reached high school, the pattern was so entrenched that I stopped pointing it out. Marcus attended private school while I went to the local public high school, perfectly decent but not prestigious enough for the golden child. The explanation was always practical. Marcus needed the college preparatory advantages that private school provided since he would someday run the family business. I was encouraged to focus on subjects that would make me a good wife and mother, as if my entire future had been predetermined by my birth order and gender. College applications revealed the full extent of their favoritism. Marcus applied to Stanford, UCLA, and USC, with full financial backing and tutoring support. I applied to state schools with the understanding that I would need to secure scholarships and work-study programs to cover costs. When Marcus was accepted to Stanford with a generous family donation ensuring his admission, the celebration lasted for weeks. When I was accepted to UC Santa Barbara with a partial academic scholarship, the response was polite congratulations, followed by concerns about whether I could handle the academic rigor. The irony was that I thrived in college in ways Marcus never did. Away from the constant comparisons and diminished expectations, I discovered I had a talent for business strategy and financial analysis. My professors encouraged me to pursue graduate school, to consider careers in consulting or corporate finance. For the first time in my life, I was being evaluated on my actual abilities rather than how I measured against my brother's accomplishments. Marcus, meanwhile, struggled with the independence that college required. He changed majors 3 times, dropped classes when they became challenging, and graduated with a barely passing GPA after 6 years instead of 4. But every stumble was explained away by my parents as evidence of his sensitive nature, his perfectionism, his potential that just needed the right circumstances to flourish. After graduation, I moved to Chicago and took a position with a mid-sized investment firm. The work was demanding but fulfilling, requiring the kind of analytical thinking and strategic planning that had always come naturally to me. I excelled quickly, earning promotions and recognition that my parents acknowledged with mild pride tempered by constant questions about when I would settle down and give them grandchildren. Marcus returned to San Diego and immediately joined Chen Construction as Vice President of Operations, a title that came with significant salary and minimal actual responsibility since my father still made every important decision. The family narrative positioned this as Marcus finally finding his calling, though anyone who looked closely could see that he spent most of his workdays delegating tasks he didn't understand and attending lunch meetings that accomplished nothing. For 5 years, I built my career in Chicago, visiting home for holidays and major family events, but maintaining enough distance to preserve my sense of self. I dated occasionally but never seriously, partly because my work was consuming and partly because every relationship was measured against my parents' expectations for their daughter. The men I was attracted to intellectually were often dismissed as not successful enough or not family-oriented enough. The men my parents approved of seemed more interested in my potential as a corporate wife than in who I actually was. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in March. I was reviewing quarterly reports when my mother's number appeared on my screen. Her voice was different, smaller somehow, lacking the confident authority I had known my entire life. "Sarah, you need to come home. Your father had a heart attack." The flight from Chicago to San Diego stretched endlessly, filled with turbulence and delays that felt like cosmic punishment for every time I had chosen career over family, independence over obligation. By the time I reached the hospital, my father was stable but weak, hooked to machines that beeped rhythmically in the cardiac intensive care unit. Marcus sat beside the bed looking lost, his usually perfect appearance disheveled, and his eyes red from crying. Dad looked smaller in that hospital bed, his powerful contractor's frame diminished by tubes and monitors. When he saw me, his eyes filled with tears. "Sarah, I'm so glad you're here. I was afraid I wouldn't get to tell you how proud I am of what you've built for yourself." The words hit me with unexpected force because I couldn't remember him ever saying anything like that before. My mother stood at the foot of the bed, her composure perfect even in crisis, but something in her expression suggested that seeing her husband so vulnerable was reshaping her understanding of what mattered. The recovery was slow and uncertain, heart surgery followed by complications that required additional procedures and extended hospitalization. I took a leave of absence from work, something my firm granted reluctantly given my position on several major client accounts. For 3 months I lived in my childhood bedroom, driving back and forth to the hospital, managing my father's care, coordinating with doctors, and trying to keep Chen Construction running, despite Marcus's obvious inability to handle the responsibility alone. During those long hospital days, my father and I had conversations we had never managed when he was healthy. He talked about his regrets, the time he had missed with his children while building the business, the way he had let my mother's social ambitions influence decisions about our education and opportunities. He admitted that he had always seen more of himself in me than in Marcus, but that he had been afraid to say so because it would have disrupted the family dynamics my mother worked so hard to maintain. "You have the mind for business that Marcus never developed," he told me during one of our evening conversations while my mother was home having dinner with friends. "You understand strategy and planning in ways that can't be taught. I should have encouraged that more when you were younger." Those words meant everything to me, validation I had never received and had stopped hoping for. We began discussing the future of Chen Construction, how the company might evolve, what leadership transitions might look like as he aged. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future where I might return to San Diego, where my business skills might be valued within the family enterprise. My father's condition stabilized enough for him to return home in June, though he remained weak and unable to work full-time. I extended my leave of absence, moving into the guest bedroom of my parents' house to help with his care. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary, just until he regained his strength, but weeks stretched into months as his recovery plateaued. During this period, I observed my family dynamics with the clarity that distance and maturity had provided. Marcus visited daily but remained uncomfortable with our father's vulnerability, often cutting conversations short when Dad became emotional or needed help with basic tasks. My mother maintained her social calendar with minor modifications, treating Dad's illness as an inconvenience that required management rather than a crisis that demanded her full attention. I became the primary caregiver by default, coordinating medical appointments, managing medications, ensuring Dad ate properly, and followed his physical therapy regimen. The role came naturally to me, perhaps because I had spent my career managing complex projects and solving problems that others couldn't handle. But it also isolated me further from any life outside the family obligations. In October, my father's condition began deteriorating rapidly. What started as increased fatigue and shortness of breath progressed to episodes of confusion and weakness that sent us back to the hospital repeatedly. The doctors spoke carefully about managing expectations and ensuring his comfort, conversations that my mother and Marcus seemed unable or unwilling to fully comprehend. I quit my job in Chicago permanently, a decision that felt both necessary and devastating. The career I had built so carefully, the independence I had fought to maintain, the life I had constructed outside my family's expectations, all sacrificed to care for a man who had finally learned to see my worth, just as he was losing the strength to advocate for it. Dad spent his final weeks at home, surrounded by medical equipment and the familiar sounds of the neighborhood he had helped build. We talked extensively about his wishes for the funeral, his hopes for the family business, his concerns about how my mother and Marcus would manage without his guidance. He also talked about money, about the provisions he had made to ensure everyone would be taken care of after he was gone. "I have something important to tell you about your grandfather's accounts," he said one evening when we were alone. "Your mother doesn't know about all of them. There are things you need to understand about our family's real financial situation." But before he could explain what he meant, Marcus arrived with takeout dinner and the conversation was postponed. Dad was tired, and we agreed to continue the discussion the next day. That night, he had another heart attack, massive and sudden. By the time the paramedics arrived, he was gone. The funeral was everything my mother had always planned for such occasions, elegant and well-attended with flowers that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Chen Construction employees filled several rows, along with business associates, country club friends, and distant relatives who emerged from decades of minimal contact to pay their respects to David Chen's success and generosity. I delivered the eulogy because Marcus was too emotional to speak publicly, and my mother was too concerned with maintaining her composure to risk the vulnerability that speaking would require. Standing at the podium looking out at the congregation, I talked about my father's work ethic, his integrity, his love for his family and his community. What I couldn't say was how much of his life had been spent trying to balance his own values with expectations that never quite fit who he was at heart. The reading of the will took place exactly 1 week after the funeral in the offices of Patterson, Webb and Associates, the law firm that had handled my father's legal affairs for 20 years. I expected the meeting to be routine, a formal confirmation of arrangements that had been discussed generally over the years. My father had always said he would take care of everyone fairly, that both Marcus and I would inherit enough to be comfortable, while my mother would be provided for generously. James Patterson, my father's longtime attorney, seemed uncomfortable as we settled into his conference room.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My mother sat perfectly poised in her black dress and pearls, still playing the role of the grieving widow, though I had noticed her grief seemed more concerned with social expectations than genuine sorrow. Marcus fidgeted with his phone, appearing bored by the legal formalities.
I sat quietly, still processing the reality that my father was gone and with him any chance of continuing the conversations that had begun to reshape our relationship. The will itself was straightforward in its language, but devastating in its implications. My mother inherited the house, a substantial life insurance payout, and control of my father's investment portfolio. Marcus inherited Chen Construction in its entirety, along with all associated assets, properties, and accounts. The business was valued at over $15 million, making him wealthy beyond what his actual contributions to the company had ever warranted. I inherited my father's personal effects, his tools, his collection of vintage construction equipment, and $5,000. $5,000. The amount felt like a deliberate insult, less than I had spent on his medical care in the final months of his life. My mother's explanation was delivered with the kind of calm authority she had perfected over decades of making difficult decisions seem reasonable. Marcus needs the business to support his family. You have your own career and earning potential. Your father wanted to ensure the company stayed in the family, and you've never shown interest in construction work. Every word was carefully chosen to make my disinheritance sound like a practical decision rather than a betrayal. The fact that I had sacrificed my career to care for my father, that I had spent months managing aspects of the business that Marcus couldn't handle, that I had demonstrated business skills far superior to his throughout our adult lives, none of this seemed relevant to the final accounting of our family's wealth. Marcus had the grace to look uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to suggest that the distribution was unfair, or to offer any portion of his windfall to his sister who had given up everything to care for their father. My mother showed no such discomfort. In her worldview, this outcome simply reflected the natural order of things. Sons inherited businesses, daughters were expected to find security through marriage. My independence and career success had been tolerated but never truly valued. I sat in that conference room feeling something I had never experienced before. Not disappointment, which I had learned to manage years ago. Not anger, which would have been a normal response to such obvious favoritism. What I felt was a kind of cold clarity, a sudden understanding that I had been fundamentally mistaken about my place in this family. I had believed that proving my worth through achievement and sacrifice would eventually earn me equal treatment. Instead, I had simply made myself more useful while remaining essentially invisible. The meeting concluded with practical discussions about transferring assets and managing tax implications. I signed the necessary documents, acknowledging my inheritance of Dad's tools and personal effects, items that had sentimental value but no practical worth to someone who had never learned his trade. As we prepared to leave, my mother made a comment that revealed the full extent of her calculations. "You can always sell the tools, Sarah. Some of them are quite valuable to collectors. That should help with your transition back to Chicago." The assumption that I would simply leave, that I would accept this outcome and disappear back to my independent life without challenging the decision, demonstrated how little she understood the person I had become. The months of caring for my father, of seeing how much the family business meant to him, of understanding its real value, both financial and personal, had changed my relationship to everything I thought I wanted. That evening, I sat alone in my childhood bedroom surrounded by boxes of my father's personal effects. His reading glasses, his favorite coffee mug, his collection of books about construction techniques and business strategy. At the bottom of one box, I found his personal journal, a leather-bound notebook where he had recorded thoughts about work, family, and the decisions that shaped his life. The entries from his final months revealed the depth of his regret about how my mother had influenced family decisions over the years. He wrote about watching me manage his care and the business with competence that Marcus had never demonstrated. He expressed frustration with his inability to advocate for a more equitable distribution of his estate, acknowledging that my mother had convinced him that traditional arrangements were necessary to maintain family harmony. But the most revealing entries concerned my grandfather, my father's father, who had died when I was 12. Dad wrote about conversations they had shared regarding the family's long-term financial security, about accounts and investments that my grandfather had established independently of my grandmother's knowledge. There were references to safety deposits boxes, to investment accounts held in trust, to provisions made for future generations that went beyond the obvious inheritance structures. Your grandfather always said the smartest money is the money nobody knows you have. He believed in protecting family wealth through diversification and privacy. Some of his arrangements were designed to activate only when certain conditions were met, protections against bad decisions or unfair treatment of his descendants. The journal entries were cryptic but consistent. My grandfather had apparently established financial structures that were separate from my father's will, accounts that my mother had never been informed about because my grandfather hadn't trusted her financial judgment or her treatment of both his grandchildren equally. The details were vague, but there were references to account numbers, to legal documents stored separately from my father's primary attorney, to instructions that would be revealed when the time was right. I spent that entire night reading through 3 years of journal entries, finding scattered references to my grandfather's hidden provisions. The picture that emerged was of a man who had loved both his grandchildren equally, but who had recognized the family dynamics that favored Marcus unfairly. He had apparently made arrangements to correct what he saw as inevitable imbalances in how his son's wealth would eventually be distributed. The next morning, I called in sick to my temporary job at a local accounting firm, where I had been working since returning to San Diego. Instead, I drove to the storage facility where my father had kept business records and personal documents that didn't fit in the house. Using the key I had found among his personal effects, I accessed a unit filled with filing cabinets, old construction equipment, and boxes of paperwork dating back decades. In the third filing cabinet, behind folders of tax records and business contracts, I found a manila envelope marked with my name in my grandfather's careful handwriting. Inside were documents I had never seen before, legal papers establishing trusts and investment accounts, correspondence with attorneys and financial advisors, and a letter written in my grandfather's voice, but dated just 2 years before his death. My dearest Sarah, the letter began, if you are reading this, then the family dynamics I have observed throughout your childhood have played out as I suspected they would. Your parents love you, but they have never understood your worth or treated you with the equity you deserve. This inheritance is not charity, it is recognition of the person I always knew you would become, an insurance against the unfairness that seems to follow daughters in families where sons are prized beyond reason. The documents revealed a complex network of investments and accounts that my grandfather had established in my name, with provisions that they would be activated only after my father's death, and only if certain conditions regarding my treatment by the family were met. The total value was substantial, over $2 million in carefully managed investments, real estate holdings, and cash accounts that had been growing with compound interest for over 15 years. There was also a sealed letter addressed to my mother, with instructions that it be delivered only if she attempted to exclude me from my fair share of my father's estate. My grandfather had apparently anticipated exactly what had happened in that lawyer's office, and he had prepared consequences that would reshape the entire family's understanding of our financial situation. As I sat in that storage unit, surrounded by my grandfather's foresight and planning, I felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood, the sensation of being truly protected and valued by someone who understood my worth. My grandfather had seen what my parents could not or would not see, that I possessed capabilities and character that deserved recognition and security. But more than the money, more than the vindication of being chosen and protected, I felt the power of having options that no one else knew existed. My mother and Marcus had made their calculations based on incomplete information. They had assumed I would accept their version of fairness, because I had no alternatives. They had underestimated both my grandfather's love for me and my own ability to uncover the truth about our family's real story. The question now was what to do with this knowledge, how to use this unexpected inheritance, not just for financial security, but for something larger, something that would honor my grandfather's faith in me, while teaching my family that their assumptions about my worth and powerlessness had been dangerously wrong. I spent 3 sleepless nights deciding how to handle the revelation that my grandfather had left me over $2 million in hidden assets. The power of this secret felt intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. My mother and Marcus believed they had successfully marginalized me, reducing me to a footnote in the family's financial legacy. They had no idea that their calculations were based on fundamentally flawed information. The first step was verification. My grandfather's documents included contact information for Harold Morrison, an estate attorney in Newport Beach, who had managed the trust accounts independently of my father's primary legal team. Morrison's office occupied the top floor of a glass building overlooking the harbor, and when I called to request a meeting, his assistant scheduled me immediately upon hearing my name. Morrison himself was a distinguished man in his 70s, with silver hair and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from decades of managing wealthy families' most sensitive financial arrangements. When I entered his office, he stood and extended his hand with a warm smile that suggested he had been expecting this conversation for years. "Miss Chen," he said, settling back into his leather chair, "your grandfather spoke of you often. He predicted you would be the one to uncover these arrangements, though he hoped it wouldn't be necessary. The fact that you're here tells me his concerns about your family's treatment of you were well-founded." Morrison explained that my grandfather had established the trust during my teenage years, funding it initially with proceeds from some real estate investments that he had kept separate from the family's primary holdings. Over the intervening years, he had added to the accounts systematically, always in amounts small enough to avoid drawing attention from my grandmother or my parents. "Your grandfather was a remarkably astute investor," Morrison continued, pulling out a thick folder of documents. "He understood that money managed quietly and conservatively would grow more reliably than money subject to family politics and emotional decisions. These accounts have been compounding for over 15 years, and the current value is approximately $2.3 million. The number hit me with physical force. $2.3 million. More money than I had ever imagined having, more than enough to reshape every aspect of my life. But Morrison wasn't finished explaining the scope of my grandfather's planning. "There are also 3 real estate properties," he said, sliding additional documents across his desk. "A duplex in Mission Beach that generates rental income, a small commercial building in downtown San Diego that's leased to a medical practice, and a cabin in Big Bear that your grandfather used for fishing trips. The combined value of the real estate holdings is approximately $800,000. I stared at the property deeds, recognizing my grandfather's careful signature on documents that had been executed years before his death. He had built a parallel financial world for me, complete with diverse investments and income-generating assets that could provide long-term security, regardless of whatever career path I chose to pursue. But the most significant revelation came when Morrison opened a separate file, containing correspondence between my grandfather and various financial advisors, real estate agents, and investment managers. The letters revealed a man who had been deeply troubled by the favoritism he observed in my family, who had made protecting me from that inequity a central focus of his estate planning. "Your grandfather left specific instructions about how and when you should access these funds," Morrison explained. "He wanted you to have choices that weren't dependent on your parents' approval or your brother's generosity. He also left guidance about how to handle the situation with your family, though ultimately those decisions are entirely yours to make." Among the documents was another letter from my grandfather, this one longer and more detailed than the first. He wrote about watching me grow up, about recognizing intelligence and determination in me that reminded him of his own younger self. He described conversations with my father about ensuring I received equal treatment, conversations that apparently went nowhere, because my father was unwilling to challenge my mother's preferences for Marcus. "I also observed that you possess something your brother lacks," the letter continued. "You have the ability to think strategically, to plan for the long term, and to work persistently toward goals that matter to you. These qualities will serve you well in managing this inheritance, but more importantly, they will serve you well in building whatever life you choose to create." The letter included practical advice about managing sudden wealth, recommendations for financial advisors and tax specialists, and suggestions for how to structure my new resources to maximize their long-term value. But it also included more personal guidance about dealing with family relationships that had been fundamentally altered by hidden information.
My grandfather had anticipated that discovering this inheritance would change my perspective on everything that had happened with my father's will. He encouraged me to use this knowledge wisely, not just as a source of financial security, but as leverage to address the patterns of favoritism that had shaped my entire life. Morrison and I spent 2 hours reviewing every aspect of the trust arrangements, the property holdings, and the various accounts that now belonged to me.
The complexity of my grandfather's planning was impressive, but what struck me most was the thoughtfulness behind every decision. He had structured everything to provide maximum flexibility, while protecting the assets from potential claims or challenges from other family members. When I finally left Morrison's office, I carried with me a leather portfolio containing all the documents I would need to access my inheritance. The weight of it felt symbolic, tangible proof that my worth had been recognized and protected by someone who understood my value even when my immediate family couldn't see it. The drive home from Newport Beach gave me time to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. In the space of a single morning, I had gone from being the disinherited daughter scraping together enough money for a fresh start to being independently wealthy, with options I had never imagined possible. The transformation felt surreal, as if I were living someone else's life. But beyond the financial implications, the discovery of my grandfather's secret planning had fundamentally altered my understanding of my place in the family hierarchy. My mother and Marcus had made their decisions about my worth based on incomplete information, and their miscalculations had revealed the depth of their disregard for me as a person. They had assumed I would accept their judgment quietly, because they believed I had no alternatives. That assumption was about to prove catastrophically wrong. I spent the next week researching my options and consulting with the financial advisors my grandfather had recommended. The rental duplex in Mission Beach was fully occupied with tenants whose leases generated over $4,000 in monthly income. The commercial building downtown was leased to a dermatology practice on a 10-year contract that provided steady returns with built-in rent increases. Even the cabin in Big Bear, which I remembered visiting as a child, was worth nearly $300,000 due to the area's recent development boom. The investment accounts were even more impressive than their total value suggested. My grandfather had diversified across stocks, bonds, and mutual funds with the kind of conservative strategy that prioritized steady growth over dramatic gains. The portfolio had weathered multiple market downturns, while continuing to compound annually, providing a foundation of wealth that would be difficult to diminish through normal spending or economic fluctuations. Armed with this financial security, I began making decisions that would have been impossible just weeks earlier. I hired Emma Rodriguez, a business attorney specializing in family wealth disputes, to review my grandfather's trust documents and ensure that my inheritance was properly protected from any potential challenges. Rodriguez was a sharp woman in her 40s who had built her practice representing clients in complex family financial situations. "Your grandfather's planning was exceptionally thorough," she told me during our initial consultation. "These trusts were established completely independently of your father's estate, and there's no legal basis for anyone to challenge your access to them. However, I suspect your family's reaction to learning about this inheritance will be significant, and you should be prepared for that." Rodriguez helped me understand the various ways I could use my newfound wealth strategically. I could simply disappear from my family's lives, using the money to establish myself independently somewhere far from San Diego. I could reveal the inheritance gradually, allowing my mother and Marcus to discover over time that their assumptions about my financial vulnerability had been wrong. Or I could make a more dramatic disclosure that would force an immediate reckoning with the dynamics that had shaped our family for decades. While I considered these options, I maintained the pretense of being the disinherited daughter struggling to rebuild her life. I continued working at the local accounting firm, continued living in my childhood bedroom, continued allowing my mother to make pointed comments about my need to find better employment and a suitable husband. The performance felt increasingly absurd as I sat through family dinners, knowing that I was wealthier than anyone else at the table. The breaking point came during a Sunday dinner in late November. My mother had invited the Hendersons, longtime family friends, whose son David was a successful orthopedic surgeon recently divorced and apparently available for introduction to the Chen family's unmarried daughter. The entire evening was orchestrated as an opportunity for David and me to connect, with my mother playing matchmaker with the subtlety of a freight train. David Henderson was pleasant enough, educated and successful with the kind of stable career that would have checked all my mother's boxes for son-in-law material. But the conversation revealed a man whose worldview was shaped by assumptions about traditional gender roles and financial dependency that made me want to escape through the nearest window. "I understand you're between careers right now," he said as we sat in the living room after dinner while our mothers conspired in the kitchen. That's actually refreshing. So many women these days are too focused on climbing corporate ladders to prioritize family life. I've always believed that the best marriages are built on complementary roles rather than competition. His words were delivered with the kind of benevolent condescension that suggested he saw our potential relationship as a rescue mission, him providing financial stability for a woman whose career ambitions had proven impractical. Marcus, who had joined us for dessert, nodded approvingly at David's perspective. Sarah's always been very independent, Marcus said, his tone suggesting that this independence was a character flaw that needed correction. But I think she's starting to realize that there's something to be said for traditional stability. Family businesses like ours work best when everyone understands their role and contribution. The conversation continued in this vein for another hour, with David and Marcus discussing my future as if I were a problem to be solved rather than a person with my own agency and preferences. My mother occasionally joined in from the kitchen, adding commentary about my need for security and stability that revealed her complete ignorance of my actual financial situation. As the evening wound down and David prepared to leave with promises to call me during the week, my mother walked him to the door with the satisfied expression of someone who believed she had successfully launched another family project. Marcus lingered in the living room, apparently feeling the need to provide additional fraternal guidance. I know this whole inheritance situation has been hard on you, he said, his tone suggesting sympathy that felt more patronizing than genuine. But Mom and Dad always did what they thought was best for the family overall. The business needed to stay intact, and you've got your whole career ahead of you to build wealth independently. His words crystallized something that had been building in me for weeks. The casual dismissal of my sacrifices, the assumption that I would accept their decisions without question, the complete lack of recognition for what I had given up to care for our father, all of it represented a fundamental misunderstanding of who I was and what I deserved. Marcus, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest, do you ever wonder if your success has more to do with being born male than with any actual talent or effort on your part? He blinked, clearly taken aback by the directness of my question. What do you mean? I mean that you inherited a $15 million business, despite consistently demonstrating that you don't understand how to run it effectively. You were given every educational advantage, every professional opportunity, every benefit of the doubt, while I was expected to be grateful for table scraps. And now you're sitting in my childhood home, explaining to me why this inequity is actually fair and reasonable. Marcus's face flushed, but before he could respond, my mother returned from seeing David to the door. Her expression immediately shifted to concern as she sensed the tension between her children. What's going on here? She asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to managing family conflicts before they escalated. Sarah's just processing everything that's happened, Marcus said, his tone suggesting that my questions were evidence of emotional instability rather than legitimate grievances. I think she's still struggling with Dad's death and the changes it's brought to all our lives. The dismissal was too much, standing in that living room, surrounded by family photos that documented decades of favoritism, listening to my brother pathologize my objections to being treated as a second-class family member. I felt something snap inside me. The secret knowledge of my inheritance suddenly felt less like hidden power and more like wasted potential. What was the point of having options if I was too cautious to use them? Actually, I said, my voice gaining strength as I made the decision that would change everything, I'm not struggling with anything. I'm angry that I spent months caring for Dad while you maintained your social life. I'm angry that I sacrificed my career to be here while you continued collecting a salary from a business you can't effectively manage. And I'm especially angry that you both seem to think I should be grateful for being treated as an afterthought in my own family. My mother's expression hardened, the careful composure she maintained in social situations, giving way to the steel that lay beneath her polished exterior. Sarah, your father's will reflected careful consideration of what would be best for everyone. Marcus has responsibilities to the business and to the employees who depend on it. You've always been more independent, more capable of creating your own path. This arrangement recognizes those differences. Her explanation was the same rationalization she had offered in the lawyer's office, the same careful language designed to make discrimination sound like wisdom. But hearing it again in the context of David Henderson's patronizing assumptions about my need for rescue, In the wake of Marcus's casual dismissal of my grievances, I realized that no amount of logical argument would change their fundamental beliefs about my worth and my place in the family hierarchy. Fine, I said, pulling out my phone and opening the photo gallery where I had stored images of my grandfather's trust documents. Since you're so confident about your careful consideration and fair treatment, let me show you something Dad never knew about. Something Grandpa arranged specifically because he anticipated exactly this kind of inequity. I handed my phone to my mother, watching her expression change as she recognized the legal documents displayed on the screen. Her eyes moved quickly over the trust paperwork, the account statements, the property deeds that revealed the scope of my grandfather's secret planning. "What is this?" she asked, her voice smaller than I had heard it since my father's heart attack. "This is my actual inheritance," I said, enjoying the shift in power dynamics as understanding dawned in her eyes. "Grandpa established these accounts years ago because he knew that when Dad died, you would give everything to Marcus and leave me with nothing. He was right, wasn't he?" Marcus leaned over to look at the phone screen, his face going pale as he processed the financial documents. The numbers were clear even without detailed explanation. Account balances, property valuations, investment portfolios that represented more wealth than either he or my mother had realized existed in our family's financial universe. "This can't be legal," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Dad's will was clear about how the estate was supposed to be distributed. These accounts should have been part of that calculation." "These accounts were never part of Dad's estate," I replied, taking my phone back and scrolling to another document. "They were established and funded entirely by Grandpa, completely separate from anything Dad controlled or even knew about. Grandpa saw how you two treated me, and he made provisions to ensure I wouldn't be left dependent on your questionable sense of fairness." The silence that followed was thick with implications that were still sinking in. My mother sat heavily in my father's old chair, her perfect posture finally cracking under the weight of realizing how completely she had miscalculated the family's financial dynamics. Marcus paced to the window, his movements agitated as he struggled to process the revelation that his sister, whom he had just been patronizing about financial security, was actually wealthier than he was. "How long have you known about this?" my mother asked, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. "I found the documents last month while going through Dad's storage unit. But I've been learning the full extent of Grandpa's planning over the past few weeks. He was remarkably thorough in protecting me from exactly what happened in that lawyer's office." My mother's expression shifted through several emotions before settling on something resembling calculation. I could almost see her mind working, trying to determine how this new information affected the family's financial landscape and social positioning. "Well," she said finally, attempting to regain some measure of control over the conversation, "this certainly changes things. Perhaps we can work together to restructure some of these arrangements in ways that benefit everyone fairly." The suggestion that we could somehow negotiate a more equitable distribution of wealth that was already mine revealed how completely she still misunderstood the situation. My inheritance wasn't subject to family discussion or majority vote. It was mine legally and morally, a recognition of my worth that had been protected by someone who loved me enough to plan for this exact moment. "There's nothing to restructure," I said, standing up and gathering my things. "Grandpa's planning was perfect as it stands. But what's interesting is that your immediate response to learning I'm financially secure is to figure out how you can benefit from it. Even now, faced with evidence of Grandpa's faith in me, you're still treating me like a family resource to be managed rather than a person whose independence should be celebrated." I walked toward the stairs leading to my bedroom, pausing at the bottom to deliver the rest of what needed to be said. "I'll be moving out of this house within the week. I'm done pretending to be the struggling daughter who needs your guidance and David Henderson's rescue. I'm done accepting explanations about why inequity is actually fairness. And I'm definitely done listening to Marcus explain why his unearned privileges are evidence of his superior worthiness." Marcus started to respond, but I held up my hand to stop him. "The really tragic part is that Grandpa hoped this inheritance would never become necessary. He wanted to believe that you would treat me fairly on your own, that his planning would remain a safety net that never needed to be deployed. The fact that I'm standing here telling you about it proves that his worst fears about this family were absolutely justified." I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, leaving them to process the implications of what they had just learned. Behind me, I I could hear urgent whispered conversation beginning, the kind of crisis management discussion that followed any threat to my mother's carefully maintained vision of family harmony. But for the first time since my father's death, their reaction didn't matter to me. I had options now, real choices about how to shape my future, and those choices were mine alone to make. The power dynamic that had defined my relationship with my family for 28 years had fundamentally shifted, and there would be no going back to the old patterns of marginalization and dismissal. As I began packing my belongings, I felt something I had never experienced in this house before. I felt free. Within 3 days of revealing my inheritance, I signed a lease on a luxury penthouse apartment in downtown San Diego's Marina District. The space was everything my childhood bedroom wasn't: modern, spacious, filled with natural light from floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. The monthly rent was more than my previous annual salary, but that hardly mattered when I had investment accounts generating enough passive income to cover my living expenses indefinitely. My mother called 17 times that first week, each voicemail progressively more desperate as she realized I wasn't bluffing about establishing my independence. Her messages evolved from attempts at reconciliation to barely concealed panic about what my newfound wealth meant for the family's social standing and financial dynamics. "Sarah, darling, I think we need to sit down and discuss this situation calmly. There may have been some misunderstandings about your father's intentions, and perhaps we can find a solution that works for everyone." The voicemails revealed more about her character than years of family dinners ever had. She wasn't concerned about my well-being or happiness. She was terrified that my escape from financial dependency would expose the carefully maintained fiction that our family's wealth distribution had been fair and reasonable. If other people discovered that I had been systematically excluded from my fair share only to be rescued by my grandfather's secret planning, it would raise uncomfortable questions about her maternal instincts and moral judgment. Marcus took a different approach, showing up at my new apartment unannounced on a Saturday morning with coffee and pastries from my favorite bakery. His strategy was transparently manipulative, an attempt to recreate the sibling closeness we had shared as children before the family's favoritism became too obvious to ignore. "This place is incredible," he said, wandering through my living room and studying the view from my balcony. "I had no idea Grandpa had set aside this kind of money. He really was thinking ahead, wasn't he?" His tone suggested admiration for our grandfather's financial planning, but I recognized the underlying calculation. Marcus was trying to position himself as my ally, someone who appreciated my good fortune rather than someone who had benefited from my exclusion. The performance was skilled but ultimately unconvincing. "Look, Sarah, I know things have been complicated lately. The inheritance situation, Dad's death, all the family stress, but we're still brother and sister. We still love each other despite whatever legal and financial issues we're dealing with." I poured coffee while he continued his carefully prepared speech about family loyalty transcending material concerns. His words were reasonable and heartfelt, exactly the kind of appeal that might have worked if I hadn't spent decades watching him accept privileges he never questioned while I was expected to be grateful for scraps. "Marcus," I said, settling into the chair across from him, "do you remember when we were kids and you broke Mom's antique vase playing football in the living room?" He looked confused by the apparent change of subject but nodded slowly. "You blamed me," I continued. "You told Mom and Dad that I had been chasing you, that the accident was my fault for not being more careful. I was grounded for 2 weeks and had to pay for the vase replacement with my allowance money. You never admitted the truth, not even when you saw how upset I was about being punished for something I didn't do." "That was different," he said, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. "We were kids then. Kids make stupid decisions when they're scared of getting in trouble." "Exactly, you were scared of consequences, so you let me take the blame, and our parents were so invested in believing you were the golden child that they accepted your story without investigation. That dynamic has shaped our entire relationship, Marcus. You've been letting me take the consequences for family dysfunction while you collected the benefits." He set down his coffee cup with enough force to make me worry about my new marble countertop. "That's not fair, Sarah. I never asked to be treated differently. I never wanted you to feel excluded or undervalued. If Mom and Dad favored me, that wasn't my choice or my fault." His defensiveness was predictable but still disappointing. Even faced with concrete evidence of systemic favoritism, he couldn't acknowledge his role in perpetuating patterns that had benefited him at my expense. "You're right that you didn't choose to be favored," I said, keeping my voice level despite my frustration. "But you did choose to accept those advantages without question. You did choose to remain silent when you saw me being treated unfairly. And you definitely chose to explain to me last week why my exclusion from Dad's will was actually reasonable and appropriate." The conversation continued for another hour, with Marcus alternating between defensive justifications and attempted emotional manipulation. He reminded me of childhood memories we had shared, family vacations where we had been genuinely close, moments of sibling solidarity that felt authentic even within our dysfunctional family dynamics. But none of those positive memories changed the fundamental reality of how our adult relationship had developed. Marcus had built his success on a foundation of unearned privileges while I had been expected to prove my worth through constant achievement and sacrifice. My grandfather's inheritance hadn't just provided financial security, it had revealed the extent to which our family's love had always been conditional and unequally distributed. When Marcus finally left, promising to call soon and expressing hope that we could work through our differences, I felt something resembling grief. Not for the relationship we currently had, which was built on inequality and denial, but for the relationship we might have developed if our parents had treated us with genuine equity from the beginning. The following week brought a formal dinner invitation from my mother, delivered via expensive stationery that suggested this was a significant social occasion rather than casual family gathering. The invitation was addressed to Miss Sarah Chen and included a handwritten note requesting the pleasure of my company for an important family discussion. The formality was revealing. My mother had apparently concluded that my financial independence required a different approach to family communication, one that acknowledged my adult autonomy rather than treating me like a child whose cooperation could be assumed. The shift in tone was strategic rather than genuine, but it represented progress from her previous assumption that I would accept whatever arrangements she deemed appropriate. I arrived at the family home precisely on time, wearing a designer dress I had purchased specifically for this occasion. The symbolism was deliberate. I wanted my appearance to communicate that my circumstances had fundamentally changed, that I was no longer the struggling daughter seeking approval and assistance. My mother had prepared an elaborate meal, the kind of production usually reserved for entertaining important business contacts or impressing social equals. Marcus was already seated at the dining room table, looking uncomfortable in a way that suggested he had been receiving preparatory lectures about appropriate behavior and conversation topics. The dinner itself was surreal, a performance of family normalcy that ignored the seismic shifts in power and dynamics that had occurred over the past month. My mother asked polite questions about my new apartment and my plans for the future. Marcus made careful small talk about work and mutual acquaintances. The conversation was pleasant and artificial, like dialogue from a play being performed by actors who hadn't quite memorized their lines. The real purpose of the evening became clear during dessert, when my mother finally addressed the subject that had prompted this elaborate social production. "Sarah, I've been thinking extensively about our recent conversations and the revelations about your grandfather's estate planning. I want you to know that your father and I never intended to create the impression that you were less valued or important than Marcus." Her words were carefully chosen, an acknowledgement of wrongdoing that stopped short of accepting full responsibility for the patterns of favoritism that had shaped my childhood and young adulthood. We made decisions based on traditional family structures that may not have adequately recognized your individual strengths and contributions. Perhaps we can find ways to address those oversights and create a more equitable distribution of family resources going forward. The offer was diplomatically phrased but fundamentally insulting. My mother was proposing to negotiate a retroactive adjustment to my treatment, as if decades of marginalization could be corrected through financial compensation. She still didn't understand that my inheritance from grandfather wasn't about money. It was about recognition, validation, and protection from exactly the kind of calculated family politics she was now attempting to deploy. "Mom," I said, setting down my fork and meeting her eyes directly, "I appreciate that you're acknowledging problems with how our family has functioned. But I'm not interested in renegotiating my place in your hierarchy. I have my own resources now, my own options, and my own life to build. Her expression tightened slightly, the first crack in her carefully maintained diplomatic facade. Of course you have options, darling, but family relationships shouldn't be reduced to financial calculations. We love you and we want you to be part of our lives regardless of any inheritance or trust fund arrangements. The declaration of love felt hollow given the context of our conversation. If they loved me, why had it taken my financial independence to prompt this discussion of equity and inclusion? If they valued my contributions to the family, why had Marcus inherited everything while I received symbolic trinkets?
Marcus attempted to support his mother's position, echoing themes from our earlier conversation about the importance of family bonds transcending material concerns. But his arguments were undermined by the obvious reality that their interest in maintaining those bonds had intensified dramatically once they learned about my grandfather's secret accounts. The evening concluded without resolution, though I sensed that my refusal to accept their olive branch had surprised them. They had expected my newfound wealth to provide leverage for negotiating better treatment within existing family structures. They hadn't anticipated that it might instead provide the foundation for building an entirely different kind of life. Over the following months, I used my inheritance strategically to create the independence my grandfather had envisioned for me. I enrolled in an executive MBA program at UC San Diego, something I had always wanted to pursue but couldn't afford while supporting myself on an entry-level salary. I hired a personal trainer and a nutritionist, investing in my physical and mental health in ways that felt revolutionary after years of sacrificing self-care to meet family obligations. Most significantly, I purchased a small office building in the Gaslamp Quarter and established my own financial consulting practice. My experience managing complex family dynamics had given me insights into the emotional and psychological factors that influence financial decision-making. I specialized in helping women navigate inheritance disputes, divorce settlements, and family wealth transitions, drawing on both my business education and my personal experience with financial manipulation. The business grew rapidly, partly because of my technical skills but mostly because I understood what it felt like to be underestimated and excluded from important financial conversations. My clients were smart, accomplished women who had been marginalized by fathers who favored sons, husbands who controlled household resources, or family members who assumed that emotional labor and caregiving contributions had no monetary value. My success was deeply satisfying, but it also highlighted the tragedy of what my family had wasted. The skills and insights that made me effective in my consulting practice could have been valuable assets to Chen Construction if my parents had ever bothered to recognize and develop my potential. Instead, they had dismissed my business acumen as irrelevant to their priorities while handing control of a $15 million company to someone who demonstrably lacked the strategic thinking necessary to manage it effectively. The irony became even more pronounced when Marcus called 6 months after our dinner reconciliation attempt, his voice tight with stress as he explained that Chen Construction was facing serious financial difficulties. Several major projects had exceeded their budgets due to poor planning and oversight. Key employees were leaving for competitors that offered better management and clearer strategic direction. The company that had been built through decades of my father's careful work was deteriorating rapidly under Marcus's leadership. Sarah, I know things have been strained between us, but I was wondering if you might consider consulting for the company. Your business background could be really valuable right now, and it might be a way for us to work together as a family again. The request was rich with implications. Marcus needed my help, but he was framing it as an opportunity for family reconciliation rather than an acknowledgement of his inadequacy as a business leader. He wanted my expertise while maintaining the fiction that his inheritance had been appropriate and justified. I'm flattered that you think my skills could be useful, I replied, allowing a note of irony to color my voice. But I'm quite busy with my own practice right now. Perhaps you should consider hiring one of the many qualified business consultants who specialize in construction management. I'm sure they would be happy to help for the right fee. The conversation was brief, ending with Marcus's promise to consider outside consulting while expressing hope that I might reconsider if my schedule opened up. After we hung up, I sat in my office overlooking the harbor and reflected on how completely the family dynamics had shifted. Marcus, who had inherited everything, was now asking for help from the sister who had supposedly received nothing.
My mother, who had orchestrated my exclusion from the family wealth, was calling regularly with social invitations that felt more like diplomatic missions than genuine attempts at connection. My grandfather's planning had been even more prescient than he could have imagined. He had not only protected me from my family's financial favoritism, he had positioned me to watch them struggle with the consequences of their choices while I built a life of genuine success and The final vindication came nearly a year after my father's death, when my mother called with news that she had fired Marcus as CEO of Chen Construction and was actively seeking a buyer for the company. The business that had been preserved for the golden child, the inheritance that had justified my exclusion from meaningful family wealth, was being dissolved because its chosen heir couldn't manage the responsibilities that came with ownership. "I suppose you think this proves your point about the inheritance distribution," she said during our phone conversation, her voice carrying a mixture of defeat and resentment. "Actually," I replied, looking out at the sunset from my penthouse balcony, "I think it proves Grandpa's point. He understood something about fairness and merit that the rest of you never quite grasped." The story might have ended there, with me established in my independent success while my family dealt with the consequences of their miscalculations. But life rarely provides such neat conclusions, and the relationships we build with our families of origin continue evolving regardless of how decisively we think we've resolved their dysfunction. What I discovered in the months that followed was that true victory isn't about watching people who hurt you fail, it's about building something so authentic and fulfilling that their approval becomes irrelevant. My grandfather's inheritance had given me more than financial security, it had given me the power to choose forgiveness on my own terms, to engage with my family when and how I wanted rather than from a position of dependence and vulnerability. But that lesson, like all the important ones, would take time and wisdom to fully understand. 2 years after establishing my consulting practice, I received an unexpected call from my grandmother's estate attorney. Helen Chen, my father's mother, whom I barely remembered from childhood visits, had passed away at 91. The funeral was small, attended mostly by her neighbors from the assisted living facility where she had spent her final years. My mother Marcus and I sat in the front pew like strangers who happened to share a surname. What shocked me wasn't grandmother Helen's death, but what the attorney revealed afterward. She had been quietly observing our family's financial drama and had made her own decisions about justice and fairness. Her modest estate, which everyone had assumed would be divided equally between my father's children, carried specific instructions about distribution that demonstrated she understood exactly what had transpired with my father's will. To my grandson Marcus, she had written, "I leave my collection of antique jewelry and $5,000, with the hope that he will learn the difference between deserving something and earning it. To my granddaughter Sarah, I leave the remainder of my estate, including my home in Coronado, my investment portfolio, and my personal effects, in recognition of the grace with which she has handled adversity and the wisdom she has shown in building her own success." The Coronado house was worth nearly $800,000, and her investment portfolio added another $400,000 to my growing wealth. But more than the monetary value, grandmother Helen's bequest felt like a final validation from the older generation, confirmation that my grandfather's assessment of family fairness had been shared by others who loved us enough to see clearly. My mother's reaction was swift and predictable. She contested the will immediately, claiming that grandmother Helen had been suffering from dementia and couldn't have understood the implications of such an unequal distribution. The legal challenge revealed the depth of her desperation to maintain some narrative where my exclusion from family wealth had been reasonable and justified. The court proceedings were brief but illuminating. Grandmother Helen's medical records showed no evidence of cognitive decline, and her attorney testified that she had discussed her estate planning decisions extensively over several months before her death. Multiple witnesses from her assisted living facility confirmed that she had been sharp and decisive until the end, often expressing opinions about family dynamics that demonstrated her clear understanding of our situation. When the judge upheld the will exactly as written, my mother's composure finally cracked completely. She approached me outside the courthouse, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face, and for the first time in my adult life spoke to me without calculation or manipulation. "I don't understand what happened to our family," she said, her voice breaking. "I thought I was doing what was best for everyone. I thought traditional structures would provide stability and security. I never wanted you to feel unloved or unvalued." Her pain was genuine, but it came too late to change the fundamental patterns that had shaped our relationships. The damage hadn't been caused by a single decision or moment of cruelty, it had been built through thousands of small choices that consistently placed my worth below my brother's, my contributions below his potential, my sacrifices below his comfort. "Mom," I said gently, touching her arm in what felt like our first authentic physical contact in years, "I know you love me in your way. But love without equity isn't enough, love without recognition isn't sustainable. Grandpa and Grandmother Helen understood something about fairness that you and Dad never quite grasped." She nodded through her tears, finally acknowledging truths she had spent decades avoiding. The conversation was painful but necessary, a recognition that some family wounds run too deep for simple reconciliation but not too deep for eventual understanding and forgiveness. Marcus had taken a different path entirely. After losing control of Chen Construction, he had enrolled in business school, apparently determined to develop the management skills he had never needed while riding on family privilege. His approach to our changed relationship was more mature than I had expected, lacking the defensive entitlement that had characterized his earlier reactions to my success. "I never learned how to earn things," he admitted during a coffee meeting where he asked for my advice about career transitions. "Everything was just given to me, and I never developed the skills to handle that level of responsibility. Watching you build your consulting practice from nothing has been humbling and educational." His honesty was refreshing, though I remained cautious about accepting it at face value. People can change, but transformation requires sustained effort rather than convenient revelations prompted by adversity. Still, his willingness to acknowledge his unearned advantages represented progress from the brother who had once explained to me why my disinheritance was actually reasonable. The final resolution came not through dramatic confrontations or legal victories, but through the quiet accumulation of years lived authentically. My consulting practice continued growing, specializing increasingly in cases where family wealth dynamics had created unfair outcomes for daughters, younger siblings, or family members, whose contributions had been systematically undervalued. I sold Grandmother Helen's Coronado house and used the proceeds to establish a foundation providing business loans and education grants for women starting their own companies after periods of financial dependency. The foundation's name honored both grandparents who had recognized my potential when my immediate family couldn't see it. My mother and I developed a relationship based on mutual respect rather than her authority and my compliance. We met monthly for lunch, conversations that gradually became more honest as she processed her own upbringing and the generational patterns that had influenced her parenting choices. She never fully apologized for the years of favoritism, but her behavior changed in ways that demonstrated genuine remorse and learning. Marcus completed his MBA and found work with a construction management firm, where he started at an entry-level position despite his age and previous experience. His willingness to begin again, to earn advancement through competence rather than inheritance, suggested that losing Chen Construction might have been the best thing that ever happened to his character development. The story of my grandfather's secret accounts became something of a legend in our social circle, whispered about at country club gatherings and charity events as both cautionary tale and inspiration. Parents who had favored sons began reconsidering their estate planning. Women who had accepted financial marginalization started asking harder questions about their own family wealth distributions. But for me, the real victory wasn't in the money or the vindication or even the family's eventual acknowledgement of their mistakes. The real victory was in discovering that my worth had never been dependent on their recognition, that my abilities had always been sufficient to create whatever life I chose to build, and that the love and validation I had sought from them could be found in relationships built on genuine mutual respect and shared values. Standing in my office on the anniversary of my father's death, looking out at the harbor where cargo ships brought goods from around the world, I thought about the journey from that devastating day in the lawyer's office to this moment of complete financial and emotional independence. The path hadn't been straight or simple, but it had led somewhere worth reaching. My phone buzzed with a text from my newest client, a 60-year-old woman whose brothers had convinced her aging mother to change her will, excluding the daughter who had provided decades of care while they pursued their careers in distant cities. The case was heartbreakingly familiar, but I knew from experience that these stories didn't have to end with the daughter accepting injustice as inevitable. Sometimes the people who hurt us do so not from malice but from blindness, from inherited patterns of thinking that they've never questioned deeply enough to recognize as harmful. Sometimes families can learn and change and grow beyond their worst dynamics. And sometimes, when they can't or won't, we have to love them enough to save ourselves, to build lives so fulfilling and authentic that their approval becomes irrelevant to our happiness. My grandfather's secret inheritance had given me more than financial security. It had given me the power to choose my relationships, to demand equity rather than accept scraps, to build something meaningful from the foundation of my own recognized worth. In the end, that was the greatest gift he could have provided, the knowledge that someone had seen me clearly, valued me appropriately, and loved me enough to ensure I would never have to settle for less than I deserved. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.